Let's go back into the 18th century for a minute, because there is all of a sudden in the 1770s and 80s a new phenomenon, the star high soprano. Elizabeth Billington, Madame Mara, and then finally Angelica Catalani. Mrs. Billington, I have an aria that Paisiello wrote for Mrs. Billington's debut in Naples, in which she sings the high G. Catalani often puts the E flat and or even the F into her music. And so, therefore, the music of the Queen of the Night in Mozart is a part of a moment, of a movement, of something that was new, the soprano that sang the high notes. Of course, the woman that sang for Mozart was not one of the people. We'll try to imitate it in hopes of getting to having a career like these superstars. Anyway, with Rossini, as I say, we're in the 19th century, and the star is mostly his wife, Isabella Colbran, which is one of these old dramatic sopranos, tending to the mezzo. Then Giuditta Pasta, for whom Norma was written. Giuditta Pasta mostly spent her time singing contralto parts like Tancredi and Cenerentola, and so one wonders what her Norma sounded like. In any event, the important thing to point out is that Colbran, Pasta, most of these women, by the time they were in their late 30s, couldn't sing at all anymore. Michael Scott, again, hazarded the idea that since Rossini's orchestra is so much heavier than anything that came before, that these women who had been trained by castrati in one technique had absolutely no idea how to sustain and support their voices to combat that huge orchestra and often sing with a chorus, which was something fairly new. And they wrecked their voices trying to work that out. Finally, we get to Giulia Grisi, who was the first Adalgisa. Grisi was the first soprano who was able, and we read that her voice sounded more like a mezzo than like a soprano. And she was the first singer who was able to sing that repertory and have a long career. She therefore worked out the technical questions of how it should be done. Grisi sang Norma. Although she created Adalgisa, she sang Norma for years. She sang Donna Anna. She sang Vestale. She sang Valentine and the Huguenots. She sang all the heaviest music. And she did so until she was a very old lady. So she obviously knew how to do it, worked out how to do it. In the 19th century, many interesting things happened. First of all, there's a terrible story I'd like to tell. They stopped castrating little boys. One of the last of the castrati was a man called Girolamo Crescentini in the 1790s, around that time, 1780s, 90s. And Napoleon, who of course conquered Italy in what year, 1799, 1800, I don't really know, around that time, who never liked music at all, wasn't interested. When he heard Crescentini, he became fascinated. And he asked Crescentini to follow him around, and Crescentini sang to Napoleon to put him to sleep or to relax him and calm him in his tent at the end of the day. And they became fast friends. When Napoleon had consolidated his rule of Italy, Crescentini talked him into making a law against castrating little boys. This all happened in what we call Villa Pisani, which also was known as Villa Imperiale outside of Venice, which was Napoleon's headquarters in North Italy. And the story goes that when Crescentini saw Napoleon sign the law outlawing castration, he burst into tears and shouted, "Thank God I am the last of the damned." I think that probably tells the truth about how people felt about castration. In any event, the public was accustomed to having the male lead in an opera be a castrato with that high, brilliant voice. What came along, very interestingly, right in that time, 1810 to 1830, 15 to 35, the voice of Rubini. Rubini was, according to Manuel Garcia, who knew him well and who certainly knew what he was talking about, was a very, very high tenor. In fact, Garcia refers to it as a countertenor. Nothing to do with the falsetto singers that we hear singing in English chapels and indeed hazarding music written for castrati nowadays. Nothing to do with that, but a naturally extremely high voice. I have been privileged to hear two voices of that category in my life. One was the great Russell Oberlin, who had an enormous career singing that kind of music, the castrato music and many other things, and the other was Nikolai Gedda, whom I heard, who had that very high voice. But one night in Carnegie Hall, I heard him sing a recital of Russian church music, of which the range in tessitura was stratospheric. And there was, of course, being church music, there was no attempt to paint a character, as in an opera. And the voice soared higher and higher and higher. It was impossible to say if we were hearing falsetto or not. It was just high. And I remember acoustically the sound zinging around Carnegie Hall, vibrating the entire space. And I thought, well, the impact of that must be not different from what it was to hear a castrato sing. So it was Rubini's voice which, in a sense, acted as a bridge for the public. So it was Rubini's voice, high tenor, which would act, because the public was accustomed to one sound. Rubini, as I say, acted as a bridge. He was enough like the sound that they were accustomed to, and yet was something that was existent in a more modern world, a more humane world, and it was the transition. Now, exactly this time we have something new happening in the technique, and that's very important. Up till now, the range that is required of the voices is a middle voice range with a very slight extension toward the high tones. There are no high notes in the music. The whole high note mania we have today did not yet exist. The advent of the tenor Gilbert Louis Dupré, who figured out how to, what would we call it, how to darken his voice and flip it over into another register without being heard, without having the change heard, invented the high note in that sense. Dupré sang the famous high C from the chest in William Tell that caused the sensation. Rossini didn't like it. Rossini was an old-fashioned person. And when Dupré went to his house to sing it to him, Rossini said nothing. He just walked over to the cabinet to make sure none of his Venetian glass had shattered. And he said at another point, he said, "You know, that sound does not fall gratefully upon my ear." Nonetheless, Dupré sang that way, and suddenly this tenor voice, where in Rubini it had the high notes, but they were not high in that voice, so that they didn't have to be shouted. Then we have the description of Dupré as a voice of the quality of a baritone, which was able to shout out the high C. I don't remember which composer it was, but they said every time he sings that C, it sounds like he's spending his life's blood. So the effort must have been enormous. But that is really the thing which announced the new kind of singing that was going to go on in the 19th century. The coloratura requirements that had been used in the 18th century continued to be used, but in Donizetti and Bellini much less than in the 18th century music. And by the time we get to Verdi, in the few notable moments, like in the first act of Traviata, there are those brilliant arias, even Gilda's music in Rigoletto, but it is no longer the point of what's happening, but rather a color that's used by the composer. The tenors are retailing high notes, and with the mania for high notes, little by little, all the low voices are falling into disuse. Let's think about it. In the 18th century, the contralto voice is used all the time. By the time we get to Verdi, there are only 2 contralto roles.